Ben Marlowe, a humble janitor at Clarage High School, secretly shelters a homeless veteran, Matthew Cordell, in the school's boiler room during a harsh winter. Despite risking his job, Ben provides food, blankets, and dignity, never asking for thanks. Matthew, a former Marine with an engineering degree, quietly repairs school equipment, forming a silent bond with Ben. When whispers of unauthorized access surface, Ben faces scrutiny from the administration. As their arrangement ends, Matthew leaves a mysterious note, promising to remember Ben's kindness. Years later, with the school facing closure, a surprising figure emerges, hinting at a life-changing revelation. If Ben and Matthew's story of compassion and redemption moved you, subscribe to our channel for weekly stories that uplift and intrigue. Your support helps us share stories of quiet heroes. Hit that subscribe button and be part of our community. In the dim, flickering light of the basement, Ben Marlowe set a small paper bag on the icy concrete floor, its contents radiating a faint warmth that seemed out of place in the chill. He closed the heavy boiler room door with a soft thud, careful not to let it clang and echo through the empty halls of Clarage High School. For years, he'd left a warm meal there each morning, long before the first students or teachers stirred, never once asking the recipient's name. It was a quiet ritual, born of instinct and compassion, carried out in the shadows of his routine. 15 years later, at a graduation ceremony brimming with anticipation, a man in a sharply tailored suit strode onto the stage, clutching the deed to the entire school. When he pointed to the janitor, old Ben, standing humbly at the edge of the auditorium, the entire room rose to their feet in a wave of respect. Who was this man, and what tied him to the unassuming janitor? The answer lay in a story that began in the depths of a brutal winter, woven through years of silent kindness. Ben Marlowe, now 63, was as much a part of Clarage High School as the creaking floorboards or the temperamental radiators he tended. For nearly 3 decades, he'd been the school's janitor, his stooped shoulders and calloused hands a testament to a life spent wrestling with the physical demands of an aging building. Behind his wire-rimmed glasses, relics of a bygone era, his eyes held a quiet kindness, undimmed by the years of toil or the solitude that had settled into his life. To the students, he was Mr. Ben, a name tossed out by the few who noticed him at all. Most teachers regarded him with a polite detachment, their focus reserved for lesson plans and grading, not the man who ensured their classrooms were warm and their hallways clean. But for Ben, the school was more than a workplace. It was a sanctuary, a second home more familiar than the sparse apartment he returned to each night, just 3 blocks away. 12 years prior, Ben's world had crumbled when his wife, Margaret, succumbed to cancer. The loss left a hollow ache in his chest, one that never quite faded. His daughter, his only child, had moved across the country for a job, chasing dreams that took her far from the small town where Ben remained rooted. In the absence of family, he found solace in the predictable rhythms of Clarage High. He knew the building's every quirk, the floorboard in the science wing that groaned underfoot, the radiator in room 204 that hissed when the temperature dropped, the stubborn windows in the English department that refused to open on humid days. He could anticipate the chaos of a flooded bathroom during a downpour, the lockers that would jam in the winter's chill, or the exact time it took to mop the cafeteria after a particularly spirited food fight. Principal Davis often said, half joking, that Ben knew more about the school's history than anyone alive. "This place would fall apart without you," she'd remark, unaware of how true her words were. With duct tape, WD-40, and a lifetime's worth of practical wisdom, Ben worked miracles, coaxing life from a building others would have given up on long ago. His days followed a steady cadence. By 5:30 a.m., he was at the school, checking the boilers and ensuring the heating system hummed to life. He swept the main hallways before the first bell, then faced whatever small disaster awaited: a broken desk, a leaking pipe, or a spill in the gym. At 11:30, he retreated to the cramped maintenance office for lunch, always the same, a sandwich and an apple, eaten alone with the quiet companionship of his thoughts. Evenings were spent emptying trash cans, sweeping classrooms, and preparing the building for the next day before locking up at 6 p.m. It was a life of routine, one that suited Ben's need for order in a world that had taken so much from him. On a frigid December evening, as sleet pelted the school's windows like tiny, relentless hammers, Ben was behind the cafeteria, emptying trash bins into the dumpster. The air bit at his knuckles, and his breath clouded in the dim glow of a street lamp. That's when he saw him, a figure huddled against the brick wall, barely sheltered from the wind. The man wore a camouflage jacket, threadbare and far too large, hanging off his frame like a tattered flag. A worn backpack sat beside him, stuffed with what little he owned. Despite his circumstances, he sat with a rigid posture, his back straight as if answering to an unseen drill sergeant. There was a quiet dignity in his stillness, a defiance against the cold and his evident hardship. Ben approached slowly, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. The man didn't flinch or beg, didn't offer the usual explanations or apologies. He simply looked up, his eyes sharp and clear despite the weariness etched into his face. "Sorry to trespass," he said, his voice steady, carrying an undercurrent of education that belied his ragged appearance. "Just needed somewhere out of the wind tonight." Something in the man's bearing, the way he squared his shoulders instinctively, the precise economy of his movements, spoke to Ben. It was the posture of someone who had known discipline, who had carried burdens far heavier than the backpack at his side. "You serve?" Ben asked, though the answer was already clear in the man's demeanor. A single nod confirmed it. "Marines. 2 tours." In that moment, Ben felt a pang of recognition, not of the man himself, but of the weight he carried, the kind of weight that lingers long after the uniform is gone. Against every rule in the school's handbook, against the caution that years of routine had ingrained in him, Ben made a choice. "Come with me," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the sleet. "Stay quiet and follow exactly where I walk." He led the stranger through the service entrance, down a narrow corridor lined with mops and cleaning supplies, to a heavy door marked maintenance only. Beyond it lay the boiler room, the warm, humming heart of Clarage High. Secluded from the main building, it was a sanctuary within a sanctuary, rarely visited by anyone but Ben himself. The air was thick with the scent of oil and metal, but it was warm, a haven against the biting cold outside. In the flickering light of the school's boiler room, Ben pointed to a battered folding cot in the corner, its creaking frame a leftover from nights when janitors weathered snowstorms to keep the building warm. "Bathroom's just through that door," he said, his voice gruff but kind, gesturing toward a narrow hallway. "But you've got to be gone by 5:30 a.m. when the morning crew shows up." The veteran stood in the doorway, his worn coat hanging loose on his frame, his eyes wide with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Why would this man, a stranger, put his job on the line for someone like him? The question churned in his mind, a quiet storm of doubt and hope. Ben's thoughts, meanwhile, drifted to his father, a man whose laughter had faded after Korea, whose 82nd Airborne stories were laced with pain. "My dad always said you don't leave a man behind," Ben said softly, the words a vow rooted in memory, a bridge between past and present. What began as a single night's escape from the biting winter storm grew into something deeper, unspoken, but profound. When Ben returned at dawn, he found the boiler room immaculate, the cot made with military precision, its corners tucked so tightly they seemed to defy gravity. On a torn piece of graph paper, a note in neat script read, "Thank you. Fix the leaking valve on the east pipe." Ben's calloused fingers lingered on the paper, his heart stirring with a quiet respect. That night, he left the maintenance door unlatched. The next night, too. Soon, a rhythm took hold. The veteran arrived after dusk, slipping away before sunrise, leaving only the faintest traces of his presence. Repairs crafted with a finesse Ben's aching hands could never achieve. 2 months into their wordless alliance, Principal Davis called Ben to her office, her face a mask of concern. "Ben, is there anything you want to tell me about what's going on in the building after hours?" she asked, her voice careful but pointed. Ben stood tall, the ache in his spine a dull companion to his resolve. "No, ma'am, nothing to report," he said, his tone even, though his heart pounded. She leaned forward, her eyes searching his. "Teachers have noticed signs. Things moved, traces of someone here at night." Ben held her gaze, his voice steady but laced with quiet defiance. "Sometimes what's right doesn't follow the rule book," he said, thinking of the veteran's quiet pride, the way he carried himself despite the world's indifference. If you think a good deserves to be remembered, you stand by them. His words lingered, a plea wrapped in conviction. The veteran's nightly returns became a quiet anchor in Ben's routine. Where he went during the day remained a mystery, perhaps to the VA hospital 20 miles away, its fluorescent halls a maze of waiting, or through town, chasing jobs that slipped through his fingers like smoke. But each evening, around 9 o'clock p.m., when the school stood silent, a soft knock, 3 measured taps, would sound at the maintenance door. Ben began to anticipate these moments, preparing with a care that felt like devotion. A wool blanket appeared on the cot, its warmth a small rebellion against the chill. Then a thin pillow, its softness a gesture of comfort. A cardboard box soon held supplies, protein bars, canned beans with pull-tab lids, dried apricots, and now and then a pair of socks or a travel-sized toothbrush, each item chosen with Ben's meager paycheck in mind. One night he left a tattered novel, its spine cracked but its pages untouched, a quiet offering to a man whose story Ben refused to demand. He asked no questions, sensing that silence was a sanctuary, a respect for the veteran's dignity as he pieced himself back together. As January bled into February, Ben began to notice the school transforming in subtle ways. A door that once jammed had opened effortlessly. A wobbly handrail stood firm, its bolts tightened. The coffee maker in the teacher's lounge, long a source of muttered curses, now hummed reliably, its inner workings mysteriously restored. These were the veteran's gifts, quiet acts of care. One evening in late February, Ben entered the boiler room to find the veteran crouched beside a heating pipe, a wrench moving with the grace of someone who spoke the language of machines. "Pressure valve was about to give us a headache," he said, his voice low, eyes fixed on his work. "Could have caused a mess when the cold snaps back. Threading's wearing out." Ben leaned against the doorway, watching the man's hands, steady, economical, alive with purpose. "You know your way around this stuff," Ben said, admiration creeping into his tone. The veteran's mouth twitched, a faint smile softening his gaunt face, making him look for a moment like the young man he'd once been. "Got an engineering degree from Georgia Tech before I signed up," he said, adjusting the valve with a practiced turn. "Worked on structural systems. Doesn't mean much now, though." Ben's brow creased. "Why's that?" The veteran's hands stilled, his gaze drifting to some unseen place. "Hard to get a security clearance when you're sleeping under a bridge," he said, his voice quiet but raw, a glimpse into a life derailed by circumstance. The cycle of hardship was a cruel trap, one that Ben Marlowe understood all too well. No job without an address, no address without a job, a vicious circle that ensnared so many, especially veterans like the man he'd come to know. Ben, a janitor at Clarage High School, had seen the weight of the world in the lines of the man's weathered face, in the way he carried himself with quiet resilience, despite the tattered clothes and the backpack that held his entire life. For months, Ben had watched him, a shadow slipping into the school's basement after hours, seeking shelter from the biting cold. Ben never reported him. Instead, he left small offerings, a sandwich here, a thermos of coffee there, gestures that spoke louder than words in the silence of their unspoken agreement. One evening, after months of this quiet coexistence, Ben's curiosity, tempered by respect, finally broke through. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice soft but deliberate, as if testing the fragility of the moment. The man paused, his eyes distant, as though the question stirred memories he'd long buried. "Matt," he said at last. "Matthew Cordell." The name carried weight, like a stone dropped into still water, rippling with stories untold. Ben nodded, sensing the significance of the moment, the trust it implied. That night, as Matt slept, his backpack lay partially open, revealing a glimpse of the life he carried. Ben hadn't meant to pry, but as he set down a fresh sandwich for the morning, his eyes caught the glint of something inside. A wooden box, polished to a shine despite the grime of Matt's circumstances. Within it, a faded military ID card, a Purple Heart medal cradled in its case, and a photograph of a group of Marines, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, faces alight with camaraderie against the backdrop of a desert sky. The image struck Ben like a blow, the weight of loss and brotherhood palpable, even in the grainy, worn photo. He could feel the ghosts of those men, the ones who didn't come back, lingering in Matt's quiet demeanor. The next evening, Matt seemed to sense Ben's unspoken questions. He sat across from him, the dim light of the basement casting shadows across his face, and spoke in a voice stripped of emotion as though reciting a report. "Lost my team in Fallujah," he said. "Came home with medals I didn't want and memories I couldn't shake." His words were flat, but Ben could hear the undercurrent of pain, the kind that clawed at a man's soul point blank after the gunfire faded. Matt's eyes, though, remained steady. "My wife, she couldn't handle who I'd become. Parents passed while I was overseas. House was foreclosed during my third tour." Each sentence was a brick in the woods of his isolation, built by a world that had turned its back on him. Ben's throat tightened. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling hollow against the magnitude of Matt's loss. Matt shook his head, his expression unyielding. "I'm not telling you for pity, just so you know why." He gestured to the worn backpack, the sleeping bag, the life reduced to what he could carry. "But I made a promise to my sergeant before he died. Said I'd make something meaningful when I got back." His voice softened, a flicker of hope battling the resignation. "Still working on that." Ben nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of Matt's story. He understood that some promises were anchors, holding a man steady even when the world tried to sweep him away. Their arrangement continued through the bitter winter term into the tentative bloom of spring. Matt, ever resourceful, began to leave his mark on the school in small, unnoticed ways. He fixed sticky windows in empty classrooms, unclogged drains in rarely used bathrooms, and tightened loose hinges on storage doors. These were quiet acts of care, invisible to the students and teachers who passed through the halls. But to Ben, they were a testament to Matt's refusal to be defined by his circumstances. Each repair eased Ben's workload, a silent partnership forged in mutual respect. But secrets in small institutions have a way of unraveling. By April, whispers began to circulate among the faculty. A geometry teacher, ever vigilant, noticed footprints and disturbed dust in a storage area near the basement. The school resource officer conducted a perfunctory investigation, finding nothing conclusive but filing a report that noted unauthorized access concerns. The administration, already on edge, tightened security, their eyes scanning for any breach in protocol. Ben felt the noose tightening. For the second time in his long tenure, Ben was summoned to Principal Davis's office. The air was thick with formality, the warmth of his decades of service forgotten. "Mr. Marlowe," Principal Davis began, her voice clipped, "we have reason to believe you've been allowing someone to shelter in the school after hours. This is a serious breach of security protocols and potentially endangers our students." Ben's heart pounded, but his voice remained steady. "No student has ever been at risk," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. Her eyebrows shot up, sensing an admission. "So you admit it?" The vice principal, silent until now, leaned forward, his tone sharp. "We could terminate your employment for this, Ben, decades of service or not." Ben looked at them, these administrators who sat in heated offices while he scrubbed floors and mopped up the messes of teenage life. He thought of Matt, of the purple heart tucked away in that wooden box, of the promise to a dying sergeant. "If I lose my job because I refuse to turn away someone who fought for his country, then I'll accept that consequence," he said, his voice calm but resolute. The meeting ended with a final warning rather than a pink slip, a grudging concession to Ben's long service and the lack of concrete evidence. But the school doubled down on security. New locks were installed on maintenance areas, cameras were checked, and vigilance became the order of the day. That night, Ben faced the painful task of telling Matt their arrangement had to end. He found Matt in the basement, his belongings already neatly packed, as if he'd sensed the inevitable. Ben's words caught in his throat, but Matt's quiet dignity made it easier. "You've done more than enough," Matt said, extending his hand, "more than anyone has in years." His grip was firm, his eyes steady with gratitude and resolve. Before he left, Matt pressed a small, folded paper into Ben's hand. "If you ever hear my name someday, know that I never forgot," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a vow. Ben kept that paper in his locker for 15 years, through 3 principals and countless students who passed through Clarage High School. Its contents were private, a sacred trust between two men who had shared a fleeting but profound connection. It was a reminder of a promise Ben couldn't fully comprehend, but somehow believed would be kept. Every time he opened his locker, he saw it, a small folded piece of paper that held the weight of Matt's story, his sacrifice, and his unyielding hope. The school had weathered decades of upheaval, shifting administrations, curriculum overhauls, and relentless budget cuts that eroded its once vibrant spirit. Clarage High, a place that had stood as a beacon of pride for the community, now teetered on the edge of collapse, its hallways echoing with the ghosts of better days. Paint peeled from the walls, and the heating system groaned like an old beast struggling to breathe. The current principal, Karen Mitchell, a woman worn thin by the weight of her responsibilities, fought to keep the school afloat. Her days were a blur of frantic emails, dwindling enrollment numbers, and the constant scramble for resources that never seemed enough. At 52, her sharp mind was dulled by exhaustion, her optimism chipped away by years of battling a system that seemed to care less with each passing semester. Yet, she carried on, driven by a stubborn loyalty to the students and staff who depended on her, even as she felt the ground slipping beneath her feet. Ben Marlowe, now 78, moved through the school with the slow, deliberate steps of a man whose body was beginning to betray him. His hands, calloused and scarred from decades of fixing pipes, patching roofs, and coaxing life from the school's ancient systems, still worked with a quiet precision. His gray eyes held a spark of determination that age couldn't dim. The younger maintenance workers, with their fleeting tenures and lack of patience for the building's quirks, came and went like seasons. They couldn't decipher the school's labyrinthine boiler system or know which floorboards creaked loudest underfoot the way Ben did. Some teachers, noticing his slower gait and the way he lingered over his tasks, whispered that he should retire. But the truth was unspoken, yet undeniable. Ben needed the school as much as it needed him. The meager paycheck was nothing compared to the purpose he found in its walls, a purpose that had anchored him through a lifetime of quiet service. In early March, the announcement hit like a sudden frost. The district planned to shutter Clarage High at the end of the academic year. The land, prime real estate in the heart of the city, had caught the eye of developers eager to transform it into luxury condominiums. Teachers would be scattered to other schools, students shuffled into already overcrowded classrooms across the district. A community meeting was called to address the uproar, and the gymnasium filled with a restless crowd, parents gripped by worry, alumni clinging to memories, and staff staring down uncertain futures. Karen stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her notes. She tried to project calm, but her voice wavered under the weight of the crowd's grief and anger. "We understand your disappointment," she began, her words carefully measured, "but the financial realities." Her sentence was cut short by the sharp sound of car doors slamming outside. Heads turned toward the gymnasium's windows, where four sleek black SUVs gleamed in the circular driveway, their polished surfaces catching the afternoon sun like mirrors. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as the double doors at the back swung open. A man in a charcoal suit, tailored to perfection, stepped inside, followed by a small entourage carrying leather portfolios. His presence was magnetic, not loud or ostentatious, but radiating the quiet authority of someone who knew his words carried weight. Matthew J. Cordell, CEO of Cordell Defense Systems, moved with purpose toward the front of the room, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor. He offered Karen a respectful nod, acknowledging her place before turning to face the crowd. Every eye was on him, the air thick with curiosity and tension. "Please forgive the interruption," he said, his voice steady and clear, cutting through the room's restless energy. "My name is Matthew J. Cordell, and I'm here because I have information that pertains to your discussion." At the back of the gymnasium, Ben, who had been leaning against the wall as he always did, unnoticed and unassuming, felt his heart lurch. The pen in his hand slipped, clattering to the floor. The small sound drew glances, including one from Cordell, whose composed expression flickered with something softer. Recognition, perhaps, or something deeper. Ben's breath caught in his throat, his mind racing to place the man whose presence felt both unfamiliar and strangely significant. Cordell opened a slim leather portfolio, pulling out a stack of documents with deliberate care. "I've just come from the district offices," he said, his tone measured but firm. I've presented an alternative proposal for Clarage High School. The room stirred, a low hum of confusion and cautious hope. Karen stepped forward, her brow furrowed, her voice tinged with disbelief. Mr. Cordell, I don't understand. The school board didn't mention any competing offers. That's because the final arrangements were completed this morning, Cordell replied, handing her the top document with a calm assurance. My company has purchased this property, not for residential development, but to preserve and expand its educational mission. Clay Ridge will operate as a public charter school with a focus on specialized STEM programming and full scholarships for the children of veterans. The gymnasium erupted in a wave of gasps, whispers, and scattered applause. Parents exchanged wide-eyed glances, their fear giving way to tentative hope. Teachers leaned toward one another, their urgent whispers a mix of skepticism and excitement. Karen clutched the document, her mind reeling as she tried to process the sudden shift in the school's fate. Cordell stood unmoved by the chaos, waiting patiently for the noise to settle. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new weight, a hint of vulnerability that softened his polished demeanor. Some of you may wonder why a defense contractor would invest in a struggling high school, he said, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on the back wall. The answer is simple but personal. He paused, the silence heavy with anticipation. Ben Marlowe, would you join me, please? All eyes turned to Ben, who stood frozen, his weathered face a mask of disbelief. His heart pounded, a mix of confusion and an inexplicable pull toward the man at the front. After a moment's hesitation, he began to move, his worn work boots squeaking faintly against the polished floor. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of his years and the school's history pressed down on him. When he reached the front, Cordell extended his hand, his eyes holding Ben's with a warmth that seemed to reach across decades. The air in the auditorium hung heavy with anticipation as Matthew Cordell, a sharply dressed executive with an aura of quiet authority, extended his hand toward Ben Marlowe. Do you remember me, Mr. Marlowe? His voice carried a warmth that seemed to pierce through the years, steady and deliberate, yet laced with a vulnerability that made the room lean in closer. Ben, the elderly janitor who had spent decades blending into the background of Clarage High School, froze. His weathered hands paused mid-motion, clutching a worn broom as if it were an anchor to the present. His eyes, clouded with age but sharp with memory, met Cordell's. A flicker of recognition sparked, and for a moment the weight of decades seemed to dissolve. The lines on Ben's face softened. His stooped shoulders straightened slightly, as if the past had reached out to pull him back. Yes, sir, I do, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, thick with the gravity of the moment. Cordell turned to face the crowd, teachers, parents, and administrators packed into the auditorium, their expressions a mix of curiosity and confusion. He stood tall, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the tattered military fatigues he'd once worn. 15 years ago, he began, his voice steady but brimming with emotion. I was a man at the end of his rope. 3 tours with the Marines left me with scars no one could see, and a life on the streets that made me feel less than human. I was invisible to the world. Someone people crossed the street to avoid. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. But not to this man. He gestured toward Ben, his hands steady, but his eyes glistening with gratitude. When I had nothing, Ben Marlowe gave me shelter in the boiler room of this very building. A collective gasp rippled through the audience, a wave of shock and awe. Teachers who had passed Ben in the halls for years, barely registering his presence, now stared at him as if seeing a stranger. Parents who had only ever noticed the janitor when a spill needed cleaning or a door needed unlocking, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their perceptions unraveling. Ben, meanwhile, stood rooted to the spot, his eyes fixed on the floor. The spotlight of attention felt foreign, almost suffocating, to a man who had spent his life in the shadows, quietly ensuring the school ran smoothly. Cordell's voice grew heavier, each word deliberate, as if he were unburdening a debt he'd carried for years. For months, Ben didn't just give me a place to sleep. He gave me something far more precious: dignity. When the world had written me off as a lost cause, he treated me like a person, not a problem to be swept away. He didn't know it then, but those months in the boiler room were my lifeline. After hours, I'd slip into the school's library and used the old computer to tinker with a targeting algorithm. It was just an idea then, a flicker of hope in the dark. But that flicker became the foundation of my company. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Teachers exchanged wide-eyed glances, their minds racing to reconcile the unassuming janitor with the man who had quietly changed a life. Cordell's gaze returned to Ben, his voice softening but resolute. No one knew my name back then. I was just another face in the cold, another veteran the world had forgotten. But I never forgot yours, Ben. You were the first person to see me as a man, not a burden. Ben's throat tightened, his weathered hands gripping the broom handle harder. He wanted to shrink away, to retreat to the familiar solitude of his work. But Cordell's words held him in place, each one a tether to a past he hadn't realized had meant so much. He'd never thought of his actions as extraordinary, just a small kindness, a warm corner for someone in need. Yet here was this man, now a titan of industry, standing before a crowd and calling him a hero. Cordell shifted gears, his tone becoming crisp as he outlined his vision for Clarage High School. The renovation plans were nothing short of transformative. Cutting-edge science laboratories equipped with the latest technology, a state-of-the-art technology center to rival top universities, upgraded athletic facilities to nurture young talent, and enhanced security systems to ensure safety. The school's historic architecture, with its weathered brick and stained glass windows, would be preserved, a nod to its legacy, while the infrastructure would be modernized to meet the demands of the 21st century. Teacher salaries would rise significantly, designed to attract the brightest minds to shape the next generation. The crowd listened in stunned silence, their earlier skepticism giving way to a cautious hope. There is one condition, Cordell added, his voice firm but warm, and it is non-negotiable. Ben Marlowe must be offered the position of Facilities Director Emeritus, with full benefits and a salary that reflects his invaluable knowledge of this building. A murmur of approval swept through the room, though Ben's face flushed with unease. He'd never sought recognition, let alone a title. The idea of being celebrated felt as foreign as the gleaming future Cordell described. Principal Mitchell, still grappling with the surreal turn of events, managed to find his voice. "And if Mr. Marlowe wishes to retire?" he asked, his tone tentative, as if testing the waters of this extraordinary moment. Cordell's lips curved into a gentle smile, one that carried both gratitude and resolve. Then he'll receive a pension that honors his 30 years of service, not the inadequate one currently budgeted, but one that reflects the debt this community owes him. As the meeting adjourned, the auditorium buzzed with excitement, a renewed sense of possibility crackling in the air. Parents whispered about the promise of better opportunities for their children. Teachers exchanged hopeful glances, imagining classrooms equipped with tools they'd only dreamed of. But for Ben, the world felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. He lingered near the edge of the stage, his broom still in hand, unsure how to navigate the sudden spotlight. Cordell approached him quietly, away from the crowd's eager eyes. "I hope I didn't embarrass you," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "But some debts can't go unpaid, Ben." Ben swallowed hard, his voice rough but steady. "You didn't owe me anything, Mr. Cordell." The words felt inadequate, a reflex born of humility, but they were all he could muster. "Matthew," the younger man corrected gently, his eyes locking with Ben's. "And yes, I did. You saw me when I was invisible. That's worth more than any building could ever cost." That summer, Clarage High School became a hive of activity. Construction crews worked tirelessly, their hammers and drills echoing through the halls as they transformed the aging institution. Classrooms, once dim and cramped, were reborn with sleek, modern designs, outfitted with interactive whiteboards and high-speed internet. The science labs gleamed with new equipment, ready to inspire experiments that could spark the next great discovery. The athletic facilities, once crumbling and outdated, now boasted pristine fields and courts, a testament to the school's renewed commitment to its students' potential. Yet the building's historic facade remained untouched, its weathered bricks standing as a reminder of the past, even as the future took shape inside. The changes went beyond bricks and mortar. Matthew Cordell's foundation poured resources into the school, recruiting top-tier educators with salaries 30% above district standards. The curriculum expanded to include specialized tracks in engineering, computer science, and entrepreneurship, designed to prepare students for a world that demanded innovation. The old library, once a dusty relic, was transformed into a digital learning commons, its shelves replaced with sleek workstations and resources that rivaled those of elite colleges. Every classroom now hummed with possibility, a far cry from the dying institution that had once faced closure. Perhaps the most profound change was the establishment of the Veterans Children's Scholarship Fund, a legacy of Cordell's own journey. The fund guaranteed full college tuition for the children of military families, ensuring that no one would be left behind because of circumstance. Mentorship programs connected students with professionals in their fields, offering guidance and inspiration to those who, like Cordell once had, needed someone to believe in them. Through it all, Ben Marlowe watched from the sidelines, his broom still in hand, but his heart fuller than it had ever been. He hadn't asked for recognition, hadn't sought to be a hero. But as he walked the halls of the transformed school, seeing students light up with excitement and teachers brimming with purpose, he felt a quiet pride. His small act of kindness, born of nothing more than a belief in doing what was right, had rippled outward, changing not just one life but an entire community. And in that, he found a kind of justice, not the loud, triumphant kind, but the quiet, enduring sort that comes when good deeds, however small, finally receive their due. The school district buzzed with newfound energy, a vibrant pulse that hadn't been felt in years. A mentorship program, linking students with accomplished veterans from fields as diverse as medicine, engineering, and law, had ignited a spark. Word spread quickly, and soon families from neighboring areas flooded the district with enrollment applications, eager to secure a place in a community suddenly alive with possibility. Parents spoke in hushed, hopeful tones about the opportunities their children might find here, while students whispered about the stories they'd heard, tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The transformation was palpable, but for Ben, the heart of it all lay in the newly christened Hall of Quiet Heroes. The main hallway, once a drab passage marked by peeling paint and flickering lights, had been reborn. Now it stood as a testament to the community's unsung champions. Its walls were adorned with framed photographs and carefully crafted plaques, each telling the story of a local veteran or first responder. There was the firefighter who'd run into a burning house to save a family's dog, the paramedic who'd worked tirelessly through a blizzard to deliver supplies, the Vietnam veteran who'd quietly volunteered at the food bank for decades. These were people who'd lived among them, their courage woven into the fabric of everyday life, unnoticed until now. Students walked these halls daily, their footsteps echoing against polished floors, their eyes tracing the names and faces of those who'd shaped their town without ever seeking applause. For the kids, it was a daily reminder that heroism didn't always wear a cape or command a spotlight. It often looked like the neighbor next door, quietly doing what needed to be done. Ben would pause sometimes, mop in hand, and watch the students linger by the plaques. A sophomore might squint at a black and white photo of a young woman in a nurse's uniform, reading about her service in Desert Storm. A senior might trace the engraved name of a police officer who'd mentored kids in the community center. Ben's chest would tighten with a quiet pride, not for himself, but for the way these stories seemed to sink into the students' hearts. He wondered what they saw when they looked at those faces. Did they see their own potential reflected back? Did they feel the weight of lives lived with purpose? He hoped so. The boiler room, that dim, forgotten corner of the school where Ben had spent countless nights wrestling with an ancient heating system, had undergone its own metamorphosis. The clanking, temperamental beast of a furnace was gone, replaced by sleek, modern equipment that hummed efficiently. But the room itself hadn't been erased. Instead, it had been transformed into a small museum, a sacred space dedicated to the school's history and the people who'd shaped it. A simple bronze plaque hung beside the door, its inscription understated yet profound, in honor of one night of shelter that changed 2 lives. Ben would run his fingers over the words sometimes, late at night when the school was quiet. He didn't fully understand the weight of that night, not even now, but he felt it, a quiet ripple that had grown into something far bigger than himself. His daily rounds were different now. Where he'd once moved through the school like a ghost, unnoticed and unacknowledged, he now had an assistant, a young man fresh out of college, eager to learn the ropes. The school had even invested in proper equipment, a new cart, tools that didn't creak with age, and a uniform that actually fit. But the real change was in the students. Kids who'd once rushed past him, heads down and earbuds in, now called out, "Morning, Mr. Ben," or "Hey, Ben, you see the game last night?" Some lingered, asking about the school's past, when the gym had been built, why the third-floor windows were mismatched, what the cafeteria was like in the 90s. Their curiosity caught him off guard, and he'd find himself digging through memories he hadn't touched in years, piecing together stories of a building that had stood longer than most of them had been alive. Teachers, too, saw him differently. Where they'd once nodded politely or ignored him altogether, they now sought him out. "Ben, would you mind talking to my history class?" they'd ask. Tell them about the school back in the day. He'd shuffle into classrooms, a little uneasy under the fluorescent lights, and share stories of the school's evolution over his 3 decades as its caretaker. He'd talk about the time the roof leaked during a championship basketball game, or how the old principal used to sneak kids extra cookies from the cafeteria. The students would lean forward, eyes wide, and Ben would feel a flicker of something unfamiliar. Pride, maybe, or purpose. He wasn't used to being seen, but he was starting to understand what it meant to be valued. The grand reopening ceremony was a spectacle unlike anything the town had ever seen. The new auditorium gleamed, its rows of plush seats filled with students, parents, community members, and even a few reporters, their cameras flashing as they documented the occasion. The story of a homeless veteran turned defense contractor saving a struggling school had captured imaginations far beyond the district's borders. People wanted to know how it had happened, how a single act of kindness had sparked such a transformation. At the center of it all was Matthew Cordell, standing tall at the podium in his Marine dress uniform, the crisp lines of his jacket a stark contrast to the worn clothes he had once worn on the streets. Cordell's voice carried a quiet authority as he began. "We're taught to measure success by what we can count. Dollars in the bank, titles on a business card, things we can hold in our hands. But those measures miss the heart of what it means to be human." His gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Ben, who sat in the front row, hands folded tightly in his lap. Ben shifted uncomfortably, unused to the attention, but Cordell's words held him in place. "This man," Cordell continued, gesturing toward Ben, "never chased wealth or fame. He never led a company or built a skyscraper. By the world's standards, his life might seem small. But the truth is, his compassion has touched lives in ways that ripple far beyond this room, beyond this town, beyond anything we can quantify." The auditorium fell silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Cordell's composure wavered for a moment, his eyes glistening with something raw and unguarded. "There was a time," he said it, his voice softer now, "when I believed I was worthless. War had taken everything, my confidence, my purpose, my hope. I was just another broken veteran, invisible to the world, someone people stepped around on the sidewalk." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. But then a janitor, a man with his own struggles, his own long nights, saw me. He didn't just see a problem to avoid. He saw a person worth helping, worth treating with dignity. That single act of kindness, that moment of being truly seen, changed the trajectory of my life. Ben stared at the floor, his throat tight. He remembered that night, Matthew shivering in the boiler room, his eyes hollow but sharp with something unbroken. Ben hadn't thought much of it at the time. He'd just done what felt right. But hearing Matthew now, hearing the depth of what that night had meant, made his chest ache with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. He hadn't known, not really, how much it had mattered. After the ceremony, the crowd spilled into the halls, their voices a warm hum of excitement and pride. Ben slipped away to the new science wing, his usual refuge when things felt overwhelming. He moved through the gleaming labs, checking light switches and door locks with the same meticulous care he'd always applied. Cordell found him there, a familiar smile tugging at his lips. "Still working overtime?" he teased. Ben chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. "Old habits die hard." Cordell reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, folded piece of paper. Ben's breath caught it and he recognized it. The note Matthew had given him 15 years ago, the one he'd tucked away in a drawer without fully understanding why. You kept it, Cordell said, his voice tinged with wonder. Never knew what it was, Ben admitted, his cheeks flushing. But it felt important. Cordell unfolded the paper with care, revealing a dense, handwritten algorithm. The ink faded but still legible. This, he said, was the seed of everything I've built. I wrote it that night in the boiler room before I left. It's the foundation of systems used by defense agencies around the world now. He pressed the paper into Ben's hands, his grip firm and deliberate. It belongs with you. You were the spark that made it possible. Ben stared at the paper, his fingers trembling slightly. He didn't understand the numbers and symbols scrawled across it, but he felt their weight, their significance. He folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket, a quiet promise to keep it safe. As graduation season approached, Ben noticed something extraordinary. Every senior, no matter their background or family income, received college acceptance letters. He overheard their excited chatter in the halls, their voices bright with dreams of futures they hadn't dared imagine before. Curious, he stopped by the guidance counselor's office one afternoon. "What's going on with all these acceptances?" he asked, half expecting a complicated explanation. The counselor smiled, her eyes twinkling with a secret she was delighted to share. An anonymous donor set up a full scholarship fund. Every Clarage graduate gets a shot at college now. No exceptions. Ben didn't ask who the donor was. He didn't need to. He pictured Matthew standing at that podium, speaking of ripples and impact. Some acts of kindness, Ben realized, didn't just echo. They multiplied, reshaping lives in ways no one could predict. As he walked the halls that evening, the school quiet except for the hum of the new heating system, Ben thought about the people he'd helped over the years. Most of their names had faded from his memory, their faces blurred by time. But he wondered now as he locked the doors and turned off the lights, how many of those small moments had changed someone's path? How many lives had been touched by a kind word, a helping hand, a night of shelter? He didn't have answers, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he didn't need them. The Hall of Quiet Heroes glowed softly behind him, a reminder that the smallest actions could carry the greatest weight.